You're listening to or watching Strangers in Space, and for the next about an hour, maybe, we are going to be doing the 13th Doctor retrospective stroke listeners poll, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
I'm John.
And I'm a very moody looking Simon.
Well, you're very moody looking now, but you weren't a few seconds ago, and you won't be for anybody listening, but that's terrific.
Don't you just love visual jokes on podcasts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did a listeners poll, and the people who voted, they voted for their top 10 stories from the Jodie Whittaker / Chris Chibnall era. So we have the poll, and we will get to that at the other end of this podcast. I can say from the poll a couple of bits to sort of tease people for when the poll arrives later. One of those two facts is there are 3 stories, one of which I thought was quite surprising, for which nobody voted at all. So there are 3 stories without any points at all gathered from the vote. And like I say, one of those I think is a bit of a surprise. I was quite surprised by it. The other 2 not necessarily quite so much. And then at the other end of the list, there is only one story that was on everybody's poll card. So of the top 10, there was one story that everybody had in their 10, but that's not the story that won it. So that story obviously got lots of votes, but sort of lower votes necessarily than the one that did win it, because the one that won it by a reasonable distance. I will come back and find out all about that later. So there's a couple of teasers for the other end of the podcast. Meanwhile, we got quite a few comments about the sort of Jodie Whittaker, Chris Chibnall era during the course of the poll, and I'll get to those in a second. But before I get to those, I just want to get a sort of quick impression of the two of you, because this has been quite a divisive era, and it's also been an era the likes of which I guess we've never really seen before. And not just for the obvious reason, but for other reasons too. And some of our listeners will go into that a little bit. But I just want to ask the two of you, and I guess John first, because Simon and I have been reviewing these from the start. So this is probably a conversation that in one way or another we've had before, even maybe way back on the Blue Box podcast. But John, was it what you were expecting? And was it a disappointment? And you can sort of talk about what you're expecting when you talk about the terms of whether you enjoyed it or not, I guess.
I mean, this is the key. I think in one way it kind of roughly was what I was expecting, because what I was expecting is essentially based on Chris Chibnall's previous work. I don't think I'd seen Jodie Whittaker in that much. Maybe you said Attack the Block and the bits of Broadchurch my wife allowed me in the room for. So
hang on, we've got to dig into that before we go any further. Did you want to watch Broadchurch, or did you not want to watch Broadchurch? And why was she not allowing you in the room?
She wasn't allowing me in the room because in about 5 minutes in, I was cringing at the dialogue, because the dialogue was just IKEA flat pack, no subtext, people telling other people exactly what they mean, exposition heavy. And she wouldn't. She enjoyed it. So I was kicked out of the lounge on Broadchurch nights, which was fine. I was good with that.
Right, let's dig into that, because Chris Chibnall's other big thing, not necessarily that people would recognise him for, but the other thing he's worked on the most is not Torchwood, but it's Born and Bred.
Yes.
So Chris Chibnall, you can talk about whether there's subtext or not all you like. There is a particular kind of writing, and it's the kind of writing he's been practicing for a lot of his career, not necessarily all of it. I mean, if you've seen things like United, that's very different. But when he does straightforward, sort of mass audience, prime time material, he is straightforward. And I don't think that's a problem. I think that's for a particular kind of audience, and that audience isn't us. So is the problem us?
I would possibly think so, because you're coming from, whether you like it or not, 2 writers, the previous 2 showrunners, are highly stylized. You can recognize a Russell T Davies Davis story, you can recognise Stephen Moffat, very distinctive style, no matter how he mixes it up and changes almost the genre of what he's writing. Chris Chibnall is he is a lot blander, I would say.
I don't think bland's the word, see, because this is my problem with the conversation. The conversation throws words like bland at Chris Chibnall, and I don't think it's bland. It is clearly less stylized, but I don't think less stylized needs to be spoken of in such derogative terms. It's a deliberate choice.
I'm saying blander because saying there's more personality, I think, in Stephen Moffat and Russell T Davies episodes. So they are more like to you throw in a joke or throw in a character moment or a memorable line to move the story along. Whereas Chris Chibnall, he's I'd say the way I always used to put it was that Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat were artists, and Chibnall is more of an artisan, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. But yeah, it was. I think the thing that always worried about me was he saw Broadchurch as kind of influenced by Twin Peaks and all the Scandinavian noir type things. So he thought, the appeal for that was the village, was the characters. Whereas with Broadchurch, everyone who was talking about it in my work at the time was talking about the murder mystery. It was the who done it was the big, obviously big tipping point on that. And the other thing I think was, obviously I was familiar with his work on Torchwood because I'd seen all of that. He was rather, it was very immature at times, I would say, almost.
Well, you're talking basically about two scripts, aren't you? Day One and Cyberwoman, because after that, I don't think you can level that at it anymore after that.
Oh, I don't know. There's, was it Countryside has the infamous line in there?
Countryside, though, yeah, but Countryside is deliberately stylizing itself after a sort of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Hills Have Eyes type story. So you've got to expect a certain level of that. And this was Torchwood. This was what Russell T Davies set up. So this was what Russell T Davies was asking for at this point. And at the point where Chris Chibnall gets his own legs is when you get things like the Captain Jack story and the all those episodes towards the end of the first season.
But the thing I'd say about that though is that Torchwood's first episode, everything changes. It ends with the characters in a certain place, going, okay, we won't use all these alien gadgets we've got like we've been doing, and then Chris Chibnall just has them using them quite carelessly. So he almost kind of ignores what's the character work that's been done in that first episode. And I know it's an easier source of drama.
But Russell T Davies is the one who's setting those stories up. So I think you're criticizing Chris Chibnall for decisions that Russell T Davies makes there.
Well, they might be, and they might be his. We don't quite know, but I think he just ignores Russell Davies a second, and I think he's not very good at deciding what was an adult drama rather than say a teenage, almost a high. It's almost got that class.
But again, it's Russell T Davies sets that up, and all those early episodes are the ones that Russell T Davies is showrunning, and Chris Chibnall doesn't take over as showrunner till the end of the first series. So again,
doesn't he? I thought he was showrunning the first one.
No, Chris Chibnall was brought in as a guest writer. And because Russell T Davies was working on 3 different series at the same time, he gradually gave the work to Chris Chibnall to do. But Davies set up Torchwood and was nominally the showrunner, and the plan was that he would be running it, but he just couldn't do it. And so Chibnall just kind of took over because he was there.
Okay, but anyway,
but that's also you've got to look at the other evidence. If you're going to say, well, Chibnall's writing is childish, and he goes for the, but then
I didn't say childish. I said it was kind of immature in his attitude at times.
Okay, but then you've got to look at the other things he writes. Born and Bred isn't. United isn't. Broadchurch isn't. The Great Train Robbery isn't.
He might have been struggling on writing on the brief for Torchwood, I think, on that.
Well, maybe, but again, that comes back to Davis, doesn't it? He should have written a stronger brief or given better instructions.
Might well be. But yes, I wasn't I wasn't a particular fan of Chibnall.
Eventually, we'll talk about the Jodie Whittaker.
Yeah,
era,
this is what I'm
we?
coming back to. And yeah, but I was encouraged by the decision to cast Jodie Whittaker. It was, I think, with the way the Stephen Moffat era had been headed towards the end, it almost made casting a female Doctor logical. So I was quite happy that they did take that really progressive step.
Right, this is my thing then, and then I'll ask Simon, because you've just introduced what I was going to say. And I think once you've made a decision to cast a woman as the Doctor, there are two ways in which you can fall from that point. And I completely understand the way they did go, but it's not the way that I would have gone. And I'm not entirely sure the way they went was successful. Having said that, the AIs are still like 81, 79, whatever, around about 8 out of 10 scores. So the audience as a whole, by and large, enjoyed this quite a lot. And there are some people for whom this era of Doctor Who has been basically the best era of Doctor Who. And we'll get a couple of people who make comments like that in, our listeners' poll. So this is entirely subjective. But I think the two ways you could go is either you can concentrate on making strong choices, or you can concentrate on not making the wrong choices. And I think the sort of last 5 years of Doctor Who there have been lots of positive choices in the way they've gone about it. But at almost every juncture, it feels like somebody's sitting there thinking, let's not take the risk. Let's not push our noses out just in case we do something really stupid or really wrong, or in case we sort of do the thing that's going to upset people. And it feels to me a little bit like they've been making lots and lots of safe choices instead of strong choices. I said before it started that I wanted to see, oh God, and now her name's gone right out of my head, from Battlestar Galactica, Tricia Helfer. Somebody like that as the Doctor, somebody strong, imposing, somebody who would come in and not necessarily be a sort of quixotic pixie style Doctor like a second Doctor type, in the form of a woman, but somebody who'd come in and would be more of a Pertwee type, I guess, albeit without the sort of patronizing qualities of a Pertwee. But if somebody could come in and be the sort of female version of a Pertwee and own the screen for 3 seasons, I think that would have made a stronger statement. And then you can do a more quixotic Doctor after that. I think they went for a second Doctor type female Doctor for the first female Doctor. And I think the trouble there is it feels a little bit like they weren't making choices, but just were allowing the choices to be dictated to them. So even as far as the costume's concerned, we didn't see Jodie Whittaker once in a dress. And I just think that's a really weird thing to do when you've got a woman as the lead character in your show, not to ever have that woman in a dress. It's kind of and they never did a story that was about the fact that she was a woman. They did the Witchfinders.
That's as close as it gets.
Which was as close as it gets. And it's not about that. That was kind of a subtext in it, and it barely scratched the surface of that. And I just think at every juncture, they made a choice not to be confrontational. And I can see the sort of logic of that. I can see the rationale behind that, but it's not the choices I would have made. And so for me, my sort of overall takeaway from this, and actually somebody says this in the comments as well, so we'll come back to this notion. But for me, this is very much like the Peter Davison era. Terrific actor as the lead, but not giving a performance that I particularly like. And the rest of the era is a bit kind of, there are things I love about it, and there are things I hate about it. But most of the time, my overall takeaway from it was just fine. It was okay. There was something about it that just didn't quite excite me. So Simon, me and John, we've taken like quarter of an hour just to do an intro to this. So I'm going to give you 7.5 minutes.
7.5 minutes. It's it's really interesting because I was looking back as a refresher. I was looking back at the run of episodes, and I was thinking, well, that was interesting. That was a great idea. And well, this is just really. If I was reading the write up in the Radio Times for each of these stories, I'd be thinking, well, that's really great, and that's really brave, and that's going somewhere that we want Doctor Who to go. You know, and I could pick out quite a few that sort of feel like landmark episodes, strangely. But as you say, there's a kind of a disconnect, and I've been trying to nail what that is. And it's almost like the Doctor, up until now, has been like a strong personality, like a quiz show host, who guides you through the stories and guides you through, and is the central point in the show. And it's like having a really nuts quiz show like Blankety Blank or something like that, and sticking Tess Daly in the middle of it all, if that makes sense. Like somebody who is quite passive. And if you ever watch Strictly Come Dancing, if anyone listening to this ever does, you've got two hosts. You've got
Claudia Winkleman.
Claudia Winkleman, who is full of personality, quite funny in my view, and a lot of people are irritated by it, but I think she's great. And you love the bits that she's on, and then you get Tess Daly, who states the obvious and kind of echoes what everyone else is thinking, but you know, she serves a purpose, and we've kind of had a Doctor who does that to an extent. And I think that's kind of the disconnect where you've and also all of the characters, the way they're written, coming back to Chris Chibnall's writing, I think, is that these characters are written as ordinary people with extraordinary things happening to them, whereas in the previous eras, or certainly on the modern Doctor Who, you have kind of extraordinary characters with extraordinary things happening to them. So it's all of a certain level. And I kind of get that thought maybe for other shows, but I'm not convinced it works for Doctor Who, because there is that fantastical element and that entertainment element.
Do you want me to throw this theory at you? It's not a very big theory, it's just a sort of brief one, so I'll throw it out there. I think Chris Chibnall knew that when he cast a woman as the Doctor, there would be lots of extra eyes, you know, tuning in, at least at first, to find out what it would be. And I think he deliberately retuned Doctor Who to be about ordinary people and to not have a story arc at first. So he simplified the whole concept of it for that first season. And I think the idea basically was so that all these extra pairs of eyes would go, oh, that's not what I thought it was going to be. This is quite fun. This is easy going, easy on the brain. Because I think one of the things that people think about Doctor Who, people who don't watch Doctor Who think about it, is that it's quite taxing psychologically in those sorts of ways. I think people expect it to be difficult to follow and difficult to understand. And I think Chris Chibnall deliberately retuned it so that it wouldn't be difficult to follow and difficult to understand. And then clearly with the second series, the plan was always to go more back into what Doctor Who always has been, and hopefully take that new audience with you. And hopefully you've retained the old audience because they're going to tune in because it's Doctor Who anyway, right? But I just wonder if in setting up this oversimplified version of Doctor Who, the problem is not that Chris Chibnall didn't have this plan, but that because everybody on the production team got onto the page where they're making this simplified version of Doctor Who, when Chris Chibnall turns the scripts around and starts writing things like Spyfall and, you know, The Timeless Children or whatever, the production doesn't follow. So the production stays on this sort of simplified version of Doctor Who. And I feel there's a disconnect between the production and the scripts. And I think that disconnect's been there from the start, but I wonder if that's why. Because everybody had it drilled into them, let's make a version of Doctor Who that people who like Death in Paradise can enjoy. And when they started making a version of Doctor Who that people who like Stephen Moffat can enjoy, everybody else was still making a version of Doctor Who that people who like Death in Paradise can enjoy, and it didn't quite fit together.
But if your parallel is Death in Paradise, then you know the lead in that is theoretically Bradley Walsh, because Bradley Walsh is the only one of that team who's doing the big comedy moments and selling them, and the moments of character. The rest of them almost feel like they're waiting for a moment from the script to do something.
Well, if you look at Death in Paradise, the way it's set up, there are 4 lead characters, and each one of those 4 characters has a job, don't they? So you've got the detective, and the detective, there's lots of comedy and character surrounding the detective, but a lot of the comedy and character doesn't actually come out of the detective character, but out of the way the other characters respond to that detective character. So, for example, that contentious moment in Can You Hear Me, where Bradley Walsh does the I've got cancer, I've had cancer, I need somebody to talk about it because it still worries me, and sort of the 13th Doctor just kind of shrugs and says, I've no idea what to say. That is precisely the kind of thing you can imagine most of the detectives in Death in Paradise doing if one of the locals, because the detectives are all flown in. The detective is the alien who comes in from the outside, and the 3 supporting characters are all locals, right?
Yeah, I think the problem with that scene for me isn't so much that it happens; it's that there's no payoff to it at all, and maybe that's
there
what
is a
we've kind of
payoff
been.
in Power of the Doctor.
Yeah, but were they really setting it up 2 years down the line?
Well, okay, but you're stamping all over my point, John. You're concentrating on the wrong thing. I'm making a point about the kind of character that the lead is, and the lead is in Death in Paradise. The lead character is always the sort of slightly Asperger's one, for want of a better way of expressing it, where they're so focused on the thing that's in front of them that the things that surround that thing are outside of their sort of visual ken. And then you've got the other characters to pick up from there. So in Doctor Who, you've got the Jodie Whittaker character who comes in, and she's your, well, now I'm trying to think of the names of any of the actors who've played Armstrong and Miller. Ben Miller, right, was the first one in Death in Paradise, right? Jodie Whittaker comes in and she's basically Ben Miller. But then you've got Yaz, who's the one who's not proactive in terms of the investigation, but is proactive in terms of talking to people. And we're shown at the very, very start of the very first episode what Yaz's role is going to be, because she sorts out an argument between 2 people about parking right. And the way she sorts it out is by getting them to talk. And she listens, and that's it. They talk and she listens, and that's her role. And we learn that that's what her role in the ongoing series of Doctor Who is going to be. You've got Tosin Cole, whose role is to be sort of the slightly bullish one, the one played by the, funnily enough, roles reversed here, I think. Or maybe not roles reversed, actually. The young male lead in Death in Paradise is the one who's not necessarily the brightest, but who sort of goes in and gets things sorted because that's kind of his role. And then the older one, the one who was on Strictly Come Dancing, Danny John Jules. I guess that's your Bradley Walsh character, the one who's got a backstory that's filled with comedy and the richness of life, I guess. The setup for that first series of Doctor Who is exactly the setup for the first series of Death in Paradise, except in space. And I think that's what he's doing. I think he's trying to do Death in Paradise in space. But I think that when he moves back to doing Doctor Who in space, the people making the programme are still making Death in Paradise in space.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing I would say for his previous writing was, again, I think it's partly going back to Broadchurch as well, because the idea of Broadchurch, at least in Chris Chibnall's head, not necessarily the audience's, was to look at the lives of ordinary people and see what's fascinating about them.
And that's why it was a massive success.
Absolutely.
Well, they got 12 million viewers by the end, didn't it? The thing about Broadchurch is, it at a time when television was shedding viewers left, right, and centre, Broadchurch's viewing figures went up year on year. That's incredible.
It's a fantastic, and you've got to. He did the same thing with with The Woman Who Fell to Earth. The rating for that was just through the roof.
Well, it's like the 4th highest rating in the whole of modern Doctor Who, I think, with only Voyage of the Damned, The Next Doctor, and so one of the parts of End of Time or something above it.
Probably both. I think both of them might be above it, because it was obviously that was split on the BBC HD channel as well. But
oh yeah, according to the official viewing figures, though, I think Woman Who Fell to Earth is 4th at a time when viewing figures had, collapsed. So that's pretty amazing, really. And the fact that he didn't keep those viewing figures, I don't think is a black mark against him. It's just,
I think it's impossible.
yeah, with a series like Doctor Who, because the thing is, I've said this before, people love detective stories and they'll come back for detective stories. And I think that's perhaps another one of the reasons why Chibnall was trying to do Doctor Who, to make it look as if it was a detective story. But then clearly it's not a whodunit, and so that didn't work. Shall we move into some listeners' comments? Yeah. Otherwise we might never actually get there. Phil Markham says, personally, and the way I want to do this is, if you want to bring anything up, I'll pause at the end of somebody's comments and you dive in with your reaction to their comment, because that's perhaps the best way of doing this over Skype. Phil Markham says, personally, the whole era has been a total failure, not on Jodie's side, but on the production and creative side. I've been thinking about a top 10 for a while, and looking at the whole list, I can only do 6. He says it's a struggle purely because I can't remember most of them, as I've not had the urge to do second viewings.
The production, that word production, is a little bit of a broad description, because I think I come back to that point that whenever we were watching these episodes, I think we repeatedly said that Doctor Who has never looked as good as this. And I think there were some real big steps into how it was looking. I rewatched, before this chat, the Ghost Monument, and it is stunning. It's absolutely stunning, and it was quite a thing to come back with. And he kept up that standard right the way through the 13th Doctor era. I know that's a very small part, and that's quite cosmetic in the swing of things. And I'm sure at some point I'll come to grips with, or I'll come back to the subject of the music. You know, there's a lot about the production I didn't enjoy. But yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that, because I think using that word production is a bit of a sweeping description, unfairly.
Yeah, no,
not intentionally.
I think the thing for a lot of the Triple era is that Doctor Who gets made at all, particularly with that last sort of season and the specials, because no other production teams had to cope with that COVID, and that was extraordinarily well put together. Plus, what you've got to look at is that what he's introduced a lot more diversity behind the scenes as well. If you look at any of those production photos, he's done really well in broadening the voices who come into TV, or who get their say with Doctor Who.
Yeah, because that's something that neither Russell T Davies nor Stephen Moffat did. And I think it has to be a proactive choice, because it's really easy to say, let's use the people that we know, rather than let's find some people who can, bring something else to it. And I do think that maybe some of the shortcomings of this era, and when I say shortcomings, I mean I think there's a general sense, like I say, of it's erring on the side of caution in lots of ways.
Yeah, it's lukewarm in a lot of places, isn't it?
Yeah. And I wonder if some of that is kind of trying to assemble a team of people sort of behind the cameras who aren't quite used to doing this. And so all these great directors are bringing these wonderful, lovely visuals to Doctor Who, but maybe they don't quite understand some of them, how science fiction moves. And so Doctor Who became very slow. We went to those 50-minute episodes, didn't we? And it felt like we had 10 minutes less stories spread over 5 minutes extra time. And the episodes moved very, very slowly. And we are going to review Voyage of the Damned as part of this recording session. And that episode will go out separately from this. The weird thing about Voyage of the Damned is it's an hour and 10 minutes. And it's 4 scenes from start to finish, basically. And yet it feels like it moves along at a hell of a clip. And yet here we have stories that are considerably more than 4 scenes that feel like they're moving at a snail's pace. And the new cameras, all this kind of thing, the music, I wonder if this is all part of the thing that makes it feel like it's sort of slower and less gripping, less engaging.
Yeah, that might be something to do with the editing, I suppose. Because I know some of the editing towards the end got very, very odd, but I think we'll come to that probably in the course of.
Well, when you're editing, it tends to be. This is one of the things about when CinemaScope was invented. With CinemaScope, because you've got a much bigger picture, they said that you would edit a lot less, And so the movies that you made with the bigger picture would tend to be epics that moved a lot slowly and had much longer shots and much longer sequences. Things like Lawrence of Arabia, as opposed to, I don't know, you know, something like the original Scarface or whatever. So the original Scarface is in 4:3 and it's 70 minutes and it moves along at a hell of a clip. Lawrence of Arabia is like almost 3 times the length, but probably doesn't tell much more of a story, but moves a lot more slowly. And I wonder if part of the reason why Doctor Who slowed down is because they were kind of experimenting with, you know, a narrower picture, in other words, a bigger picture. And there was just a general sense of everybody easing things off. And do you know what I mean? That didn't necessarily work in its favour, perhaps. Jimmy Twizzle says it's hard to list these, as during the whole era all the stories have some parts that are really poor, be it characterization, plot lines, or parts of character traits. Ryan's clumsiness, he says, Graham's illness, for example, which are left undeveloped. None are classics. On that point, I've heard this a lot about Ryan's dyspraxia, and people saying, oh, how come sometimes he can do things and other times he can't? I live with somebody who has dyspraxia and I know exactly how it works. And actually Chris Chibnall has a relative who has dyspraxia, and therefore he knows exactly how it works, and it is exactly as Chibnall shows it on screen with Ryan. Sometimes you can do things, sometimes you can't, and the things that you can and can't do will change according to the situation and just according to your mental state, because it's not a physical disability, it's a mental disability. So it puts a block up when there's something that you need to do, and sometimes the block is there and sometimes the block isn't. And so the way Ryan's dyspraxia was shown on television was 100% accurate.
I think that works with the way it's portrayed in Ghost Monument, because the Ghost Monument, when he's asked with the gun, that's a comfort situation because he's going from a video game point of view. So
exactly, yeah,
works for me.
Richard Judge says, I sort of feel like a bad fan for saying this, but I found most of Chibnall's era very unremarkable. Jodie's tenure reminds me of Peter Davison's time on the show, where both actors might have been underserved with the scripts. Or was it the scripts could have been improved with a different lead actor? Looking over this run of stories, I think if RTD didn't make noises on coming back to the show, The Power of the Doctor could have been the last story for a very long time. Simon, could you, if Russell T Davies hadn't have been here, they would have found somebody else, wouldn't they? Doctor Who's their big cash cow.
There may have been a delay. I don't know. They must have given a jump.
Well, we're having a delay now.
Yeah,
we've got 2.5 years between Chris Chibnall's last series and Russell T Davies's first series back. We're having a hell of a delay right now. So yeah, I think if Russell T Davies hadn't put himself in the BBC's faces, I think for sure they would have found somebody else. Would have been interesting to have seen who it would have been and what would the BBC have been doing. Because maybe that's the issue, is that BBC just wanted more of the same, and it needed somebody to say, no, let's not do just more of the same. Let's have a rethink.
I mean, where it's yeah. I mean, this is a conversation for another episode. But with RTD, you're not just getting a head writer, are you? You're getting a whole new model for the series to move forward.
Yes.
So in that respect, this has come probably at exactly the right time. Doctor Who getting out while the going's good, if you ask me.
Maybe 5 years too late. Maybe what the Chris Chibnall era could have done with. I mean, maybe this is the answer. Maybe the answer is, if instead of BBC Studios carry on making it with Chris Chibnall, maybe if Chris Chibnall had made it independently and actually made it after a fashion that he could have devised himself. Because we all heard about him trying to do the writer's room and the BBC saying, yeah, no, we're not having that. And the writer's room being disbanded, right? And so we don't know the ins and outs of how that happened, but we know it was there at the start and it didn't last very long. Maybe if Chris Chibnall had had his legs and been allowed to make it in the way he wanted, maybe the result would have been something with a bit more punch and vitality. Andy Massey says there is so little of the 2 3/4 of seasons dragged out over 5 years that actually sticks in the memory. That's about the same amount of Doctor Who as Stephen Moffat made twice, right? And let's not forget, Russell T Davies was one who actually devised the idea of a gap year, and the only actual gap of 2 years between series was the one that Russell T Davies put in. So I don't think we can blame other people for that. He says, I think in some respects, Chibnall nailed the Davison era. Jodie, for all her abilities, has about as much screen presence as Davison did. That's going to get me a verbal kicking in some areas, but I mean no disrespect to the actors. It's just that they are the least developed of the Doctors compared to the visual image locked in my mind with Pertwee, Baker, Smith, Tennant or Capaldi. Saying that, he says, I actually have a massive desire to rewatch the Chibnall era before the return of RTD. So there you go, Davison.
I'd recommend it
comparison.
For the little I've rewatched. It is a different experience because you're not focused on the bits that are niggling you in quite the same way. I certainly found that anyway.
Yeah, it's like almost any era. It's you have to let it get to the end before it settles, because then people know that's not how it ends. Doctor Who continues, and in a different way. It didn't kill the show, so it's almost like a fan relief thing.
Well, and also, yeah, I think Simon's got a really good point. When you're watching something for the first time, the bits that irritate you can sometimes take precedence because you keep thinking, you have anticipation about how you think it should work and what you should think it should do. And when it doesn't work like that and it doesn't do those things, that can niggle at you. But when you rewatch something and you know it doesn't do any of those things, those aren't the bits that you're concentrating on. So it's much easier to concentrate on the stuff you enjoy the second time around.
Yeah, or if you know that there's been a payoff to stuff that maybe irritated you.
Quite. Tim Allman says, mostly a very mediocre period in the show's history. Not terrible, just not very good. And I think that kind of nails it for me, really. It was punctuated by a few gems, although I'm grading on a curve somewhat, and the final story was rather touching, even if the plot was mostly incoherent mess. Chibnall didn't have a strong enough creative vision for the show and didn't seem to want the job very much in the first place. Jodie, while very likeable, never really imposed herself on the role and doesn't live long in the mind as the Doctor. And why cast a woman in the part and then never really explore the ramifications of that decision? All in all, a disappointment. Hopefully the second coming of RTD will give proceedings a bit of a boost. But then he added, I will add, it got better as it went along. The second series was a great improvement on the first. And I think as Doctor Who fans, yes, for us, the second series was, the Doctor Who that we know and recognise. The first series was something a bit different that perhaps scared us off to an extent.
Yeah, and I mean, going back, there's a point there about Jodie not imposing herself on the role. I think there's kind of almost an issue there with Jodie's acting style. It's that she, I think by her own admission, she plays what's on the page. She doesn't look for her own reading that, go wild with a reading or anything. And she's looking for the writer to provide a spark. And I think someone, I wish I could remember, someone on Twitter, I saw this discussing it today, they said that Chris Chibnall was almost leaving the scripts a little bland for Jodie to provide her own kind of reading on it. So there might be a disconnect between Doctor and writer there that maybe hasn't served the era well.
That sounds about right. Because I will say the one thing that she does give is lots of enthusiasm. Somebody, I think it was it Robert Sherman or Colin Baker or somebody said something along the lines of, this is the most joyous Doctor we've had for a very long time, perhaps ever. And I think the sort of trouble there is I'm not entirely sure that's quite what Chris Chibnall was going for. And like you say, maybe that didn't quite translate into Jodie Whittaker's performance. So maybe the moments where she's supposed to do something a bit more dark or a bit more thoughtful or a bit more sort of to add a bit more subterfuge to it or a bit more sort of what's going on behind the eyes. And the script is perhaps trying to call for that. And because her performance has gone somewhere else, she doesn't come back around to do it.
No,
so she never quite pulls off those moments.
I think the one moment of it where I just thought, yes, you could have played it all that way. There was it's in Once Upon Time. It's a scene where you're into Yaz's essential dream sequence where they sat in the car together, and you've got them as they are on all those videos. We've got the kind of there's a chemistry and electricity to it, and that really works. And I think that was what's been kind of lacking to me with the dynamics of lead characters.
Right, George Machin says my feelings on this era align quite strongly with JR's, specifically that there's something about the production itself that's made it harder for me to connect with this era, even with episodes that I genuinely enjoy. It doesn't feel as rewatchable as prior ones either. And I also can't see myself returning to any of the below stories he's talking about his vote in isolation, regardless of how much I enjoyed them, whereas I can bang on Heaven Sent anytime and often do. So I've said this before.
I think given time,
yeah,
I think it'll be different. I think it'll feel different. I'm starting to get those vibes already. That now it's not the current era. It's got that. Sorry, another music analogy. It's like when it's your band's latest album. That's what it's all about. And that's the passion point. That's where you're deciding, is this the band going in the right direction? Is this a great album? Is it not? And then later on, when it becomes part of the collection and part of the journey of that artist, it becomes a different experience altogether, because you can just be objective about it and think, well, it's okay because it was just that small portion of time. Therefore, there's a lot to love in there.
Well, and this is where and how it fits in, right? It becomes a step on a journey rather than a destination. When something's current, it feels like it's the destination, but actually it's not. It's just another stepping stone along the path. And that's what this is. This is a stepping stone along the path. Ralph Burton, also known as Wilf, I rather liked Jodie's Doctor and era. It's so very, very tedious hearing constant, unremitting moaning about it whenever it gets brought up in conversation. I think we'll just leave that one and move on, right? Stu Gutteridge, he talked about a few of the stories, so I'm going to read this out because I've not done this with any of the others during the vote. I'll do this now. He says, because I think it gives a bit of an idea about whether or not he enjoyed it. He's spyful, pacey, hits the ground running, and the revelations are brilliant. War of the Sontarans, best use of the Sontarans in New Who, Power of the Doctor, a love letter to the fans and a fitting end to 13. Fugitive of the Jadoon, essentially a story of revelations. Take those away and there isn't much story, but the revelations themselves are excellent. And on Village of the Angels, he says a clever new use of the angels with great imagery, the burning angel, the rogue angel, the Doctor Angel, and so on. And I think sort of you're getting the idea there that what he's enjoying is some of the plotting and some of the sort of the imagery that gets thrown in amongst the plotting. So maybe the idea that he's sort of getting at is, even if the narrative isn't necessarily sparkling, the plotting itself or something about the ideas that are getting thrown into the plots are doing something for him. David Kitchen says, while the era has plenty of lows, which sadly drag down the average, its highs are very high. And I'd put this top 10, his top 10, against that of most other New Who Doctors. The run of Demons, Kablam, Witchfinders, and the one with the frog is excellent Doctor Who, showing a proper variety of styles and innovation. And I don't think you can argue with this point there.
Yep.
And Jeff Waddell, final comment. Jeff Waddell says, my favourite era since the show came back. And like I say, that's fair enough. For some people, this is the best Doctor Who has been. And I think, you know, going on Twitter, because I do go on places and look to see what people are saying. And in amongst, you know, some people would go off and there'll be great big swathes of negative commentary about it. And that becomes a kind of circle jerk because all those people ever see are the other ones who are moaning. But then in other places on the internet, the sort of Jodie Whittaker era has been cause for this vast amount of sort of positivity and creativity, artwork and sort of cosplay and sort of people living the lives of the characters sort of from outside. And there's always been that with Doctor Who, but my experience of it on social media has been that this era of the show has really sort of notched that up a couple of gears. And some of that stuff has really become, and amongst kids as well, kids love this. I hate to say it, but when Peter Capaldi was the Doctor, a lot of kids did kind of not necessarily lose interest, but weren't as spurred on by the programme to be creative in those ways. And I think with Jodie Whittaker now, maybe those kids or the next generation of kids have had that creative spark instilled in them again. So, for all us middle-aged white guys from England who grew up with Tom Baker and what have you, are looking at the faults in this, for other people, this is just exactly what the Doctor ordered, I guess.
And equally in inverse, we shouldn't be closed off to the idea that viewing this series hasn't somehow trained us in another way, that what came prior to it now suddenly looks slightly different and maybe not as positive. Because I know that rewatching some older Tennant recently has felt quite regressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I did feel that about some of it at the time. And yeah, a number of people pointed certain things out at the time. But yeah, going back now, some of it does feel quite problematic, doesn't it?
Definitely.
And I'm not just talking about Noel Clarke and John Barrowman either, but for God's sake. People on the set knew exactly what those two were like, and they weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated and joked about. Let's move on, shall we? Are there any more thoughts that either of you two want to throw in before we do the actual vote itself? Because I don't propose to sort of dwell on this too much.
No,
but I was going to say David Kitchen's little rundown of episodes. I'd throw Can You Hear Me in there as well, as far as something extremely progressive. But
absolutely.
Oh yeah. Well, he was trying to show with 4 in a row how those 4 in a row were quite different from each other, of course. And Can You Hear Me comes from but you're right. And yes, I think some of the production because it felt a little bit low key sometimes. I don't think you quite noticed sometimes some of the innovative and sort of diverse things that were going on in front of the camera sometimes. And yet clearly for God's sake, there was an episode with animation in it for like 3 minutes or something.
Yeah.
Can you imagine Russell T Davies or Stephen Moffat doing that?
I literally watched that this evening before doing this podcast, and there's a lot of work in that.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Right, the 3 stories that didn't get any votes from anybody. Do you want to guess what they were? I mean, throw a couple of names at me.
Battle of Ranskor Av Kolos?
Well, that's one of the 3. One of them is The Return of the Sea Devils in Legend of the Sea Devils. Didn't get any votes from anybody. And I know it's not a terribly good story, but I was quite surprised. Sea Devils and that. And it's quite a spectacular episode. I was surprised it didn't get any votes from anybody. But the one that did surprise me, because I think this is quite a good episode. It's funny. It's got like decent monsters. It's got quite a sort of evocative sort of scenario. Arachnids in the UK didn't get any votes from anybody.
Really?
Yeah.
And that was a pretty solid action episode.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty good. Arachnids in the UK.
Yeah, it's got.
But anyway,
yeah.
I mean, it didn't get any votes from anybody. It could have come low, but it just didn't get anything from anyone. I thought that was quite surprising. And because 2 or 3 of the next stories up, you're going to be, and that did get votes.
Yeah.
Because the way I've done this, I've given every story a percentage, and the percentage is how many votes it got against how many votes it could have got. So if something had got 10 out of 10 from everybody who voted, that would be 100%. And something that didn't get any votes from anybody would be 0%. On 0.7%, in other words, right at the bottom of the scale, in 26th place, Praxeus. So I'm not going to ask you to stop for each of these and talk about each of these, but if you've got a comment, I'll keep my eye on this screen and sort of throw your comments in. And we'll whip through the list relatively quickly, maybe, okay?
Yeah, I suspect I was the one who gave Praxeus a vote on that, to be honest.
Oh, really?
I like Praxeus. It's a really nice looking story set across the world, and the monsters are terrific in it. You know, the imagery is fantastic.
Yeah, I think I sort of agree, but I think, you know, we're talking about 30 stories basically, or 29 stories, and, you know, it's not difficult for stories to fall off the bottom of people's lists. I think it's quite surprising when they fall off the bottom of everybody's lists. We've done this before, and I can't remember, but I don't think last time we did this sort of thing there were any stories that actually had 0. So to have 3 is quite surprising, especially when you consider what the 24th and 23rd place ones were. But in 25th place, on 1.4% of what it could have got, the Ghost Monument.
Yes, as I say, I rewatched this and it's far better than you remember. Although, I mean, yeah, it kind of, I'd say the first 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, I remember watching that at the time and thinking, shit, this could be the best Doctor Who ever, because it was so well paced, the dialogue was good, the setup was good, the effects were amazing, and it literally rattled along. And it kind of, the pacing kind of slowed down after that, and the second half felt a little bit all over the place, but it's far better than I certainly remember.
Right, with twice as many votes as that, though, so on 2.8%, in 24th place, the Saranga Conundrum.
Great monster. I like a cute monster. Yeah.
On 3.1%,
Misuse of Brett Goldstein. Can I just say, sorry, Brett Goldstein. That gives it points straight away for me.
23rd place, 3.1%, Orphan 55.
I think that gets a certain bad rap for that last scene, which is extremely didactic. But I kind of like that. Was it Ed Hine? He wrote, It Takes You Away as well. I like that he's willing to fail to try and put something together.
Well, I do wonder if the direction didn't help that story, because even that speech at the end, if that speech at the end had been delivered differently, it might have worked better. If all that stuff with Benny had been done differently, that might have worked better too. And the fact that the story basically involves just everybody climbing in a bus and driving somewhere and then driving back, that could also have been handled differently.
And that dog from the early days of Channel 4 as well was just...
But some of the stuff early in that episode was great. The setup was great, and then I just think it fell apart about 15 minutes in. But anyway, in joint 21st place on 4.1%, Kablam. Simon, you must have something to say about Kablam. All right, we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
And this one I think is astonishing, but I'll come to why. Revolution of the Daleks, which is the middle of the 3 Dalek stories. So that's the one with Captain Jack, and the one with the return of his name escapes me, the Donald Trump character
Chris,
in the UK,
Chris
Knopf. Yeah, let's forget his character name. But I thought that was a pretty good story, and I wonder if that kind of lost out a bit in the poll, because the 3 New Year specials were all Dalek stories. And I can sort of understand why Chris Chibnall did that, because that keeps the Daleks' toes in, makes the specials a bit special, but doesn't, because I think sometimes if you stick the Daleks in a series, they kind of can unbalance the series.
I think
he avoided that trap.
I think the other thing with that story is it's the only Doctor Who episode in a long time, so I think it's kind of got more weight to bear than maybe the story warrants.
So. But I think it's a really good story, actually, myself. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
and I think that'll be one. Yeah.
It kind of steals with the idea from Victory of the Daleks, a bit of, of the Daleks being helpful to the British government. So,
but puts a different spin on it and does it a lot better, I think.
I think so.
In 20th place on 5.2%, Once Upon Time, which I liked, but I think I quite liked it. But I think it is the sort of middle part of Flux. It's kind of it's there to serve the other episodes rather than to be anything particular in its own right.
Yeah, it felt like kind of wheel spinning in the middle there, because you're almost no further along in the plot than you were at the start of the episode.
In joint 18th place then, on 5.5%, Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror, which is
It's a
I really
solid
really
episode.
enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed that episode.
and Resolution, which was fantastic, wasn't it?
If
That's the one with Thingamajig from Ghosts, isn't it, Simon?
yeah, and
Bob
if only
Ritchie,
if only for her performance, I think it's much higher.
And the visual of the Dalek mutant on the back as well. It's a really strong visual.
Yeah, I thought it was a terrific episode, frankly. In 17th place, on 5.9%, actually earlier on in the vote, this was a lot higher, and it kind of sort of settled a bit lower than it had been. Can You Hear Me? So that's the mental health one.
Yeah, again, I think that's a really nice dinner episode. You've got two nice villains, and that animation sequence is as adventurous as anything, well, in the era. Beautifully done.
There are lots of really strong ideas in that story, and I think it sort of does them justice, but at the same time, I think because it's doing several storylines around a theme, I think some of them seem to lose a bit of importance, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure they kind of cohere at the end either on that, which might lose it a few points.
I think Can You Hear Me will wake its way up the polls over the years. I think people will go back to it, and I think it's one of the few episodes where I think the score actually adds to the episode. Sorry,
no comment. Actually, his music got much better. I think his music in the first series wasn't tuned to what Doctor Who should be and to the energy of Doctor Who, and I think he got better at finding the energy of Doctor Who as he went along. That's my thought on that. Anyway, in 16th place on 6.2% is The Vanquishers, the final part of Flux, which I thought was a lot of fun, actually. It didn't resolve things the way people wanted it to, but I thought it was a lot of fun, really.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem. You're expecting a really, really big finish from a series, and it kind of didn't pay off with the Flux as this all-consuming threat, which might turn a few people against it, and then the main villains get off-screened very quickly.
I think I liked the way it resolved things, though. I thought it logically resolved all the problems it had set up, basically. And people say, well, it left half the universe destroyed. Well, so did Legopolis, and nobody ever criticizes it for that, right? In, where are we? 15th place on 7.6%. So we're middle of Flux territory here. This is Survivors of the Flux. I like the sort of travelogue aspect of that. The stuff on the Division ship, whatever, is a bit static, but I think that's more character stuff, and the character stuff is fairly strong. I'm not entirely sure the direction of that one gives that stuff as much weight as it really needs. And so maybe that's why it feels a little bit flat, that episode, because actually the two parts of it should have been as strong as each other. But the travelogue stuff was so much more fun than the other stuff. I think it kind of took the shine off the other stuff, maybe. In 14th place, on 9%, The Halloween Apocalypse.
As a Liverpool fan, I'm always going to give it points for having Anfield in there. It's a really nice setup. I think it's it sets up the whole Flux storyline really nicely, really strongly. Maybe you've got things don't cohere at the end episode, but they're not meant to. So yeah, I think it's a really strong setup.
In 13th place on 10.7%, and then there's a jump above this. So this poll is the 12 that everybody liked. I say everybody, the 12 that people liked and the ones that they liked a little bit less. So this is the point at which we get to the end of the ones that people liked a little bit less. And again, I'm quite surprised at this, because when this was first broadcast, the response to it seemed really positive. And it was after this point at which people seemed to go off Chris Chibnall. But it's the woman who fell to earth. And I thought a lot of people gave that story a lot of love when it came out. So maybe it's not settled quite so well in view of what's come afterwards, maybe.
Again, it's a solid start to the year. I think there's become an issue with them, what the fridging Grace as a motivation, but that aside, it works.
Do you know what? People get a little bit tangled up in whether certain tropes have been used or not. And they'll assign motivations to people writing stories according to which tropes they've used. And people don't tend to use tropes like that wittingly. I don't suppose that was put in there deliberately. Oh, I must fridge somebody. But
No,
it's an integral part of the story. And this is the thing. The people who complained that the woman who fell to earth fridges Grace seem to misunderstand what fridging is. So fridging is when you kill the character off in order that that becomes a plot motivation for the other characters to go on and do something that is concerned with the act of fridging in the first place. But what happens here is Grace dies and the other characters go traveling. The two things aren't connected in the same way as they would need to be for it to be fridging by the dictionary definition of fridging. So it's not fridging.
It kind of does go there in the Battle of Ranskar Carlos, though, with Graham and Tim Shaw at the end.
Oh no, but that's not the payoff to fridging.
I can see why people are thinking it.
No, but that's a payoff for the character, but it's not to do with the motivation. And in fact, he goes against the motivation, doesn't he? But Grace's death.
It's a conflict of motivations, isn't it?
But Grace's death would have to have proactively been the reason why Graham would go off and do all the things that he does by the end of that episode, or certainly into the start of the next episode. That's not how it works. So I think people have spotted this thing, talked about this thing on social media. Everybody's got it in their heads that it is this thing. And it's very similar to this thing, but I don't think it is this thing. Do you know what I mean?
That's fair.
And, it's Doctor Who. Those companion characters have to go off travelling. And there have to be casualties. And in order to make it, because this was the thing, do you remember during the Stephen Moffat years, there was this great big discussion about whether anything actually meant anything to anybody if nobody died, etc., and so on and so forth. And this Chris Chibnall comes in and he says, right, we're going to have a family of 3 people in the first episode, and 2 of those people will go traveling. But in order to give that story weight, then the 3rd person has to die so we can see that there are consequences. So I think that was the trope he used. You give consequences to actions and you show what's at stake. It's not, oh, she's died, so he's going traveling. It's, yeah, she died, so he knows that when he travels, his travels have consequence and weight. That was the way I read it anyway. Let's get into the top 12, the stories that people liked. In 12th place, on 17.2%, Eve of the Daleks. So that was the New Year's special that came out top. Was that the best of the 3 New Year's specials, Simon? The one in the warehouse?
No, I would put Resolution above that, if I'm honest.
And I would put Revolution above that as well, I think.
Okay.
Whereas I put Eve at the top. So.
Would you? So there you go. We've each chosen a different one. But I think the thing about the 3 Dalek stories is they're all fun. I think they're all distinctive in their own ways, and they all did things with the Daleks that I don't think we'd really seen done before. So I think they're all sort of justified their existence.
Yeah.
In 11th place, on 19.7%, Ascension of the Cybermen and the Timeless Children.
Really? Okay.
Just outside the top 10. This and the story that came 10th actually were very close to each other and sort of switched places a few times, but in the end the other one won out to be in the top 10. I am going to talk about this on a different podcast, so I'm going to keep my whistle dry.
Yeah, I mean, there are bits of this I really like. I like the kind of deliberately oblique storytelling with the Irish storyline at the start. I think that works really beautifully. It's something that hasn't really been seen in Doctor Who before. I think it works sort of less well for me when you just get into the Gallifrey mythology again, which I think I always get the impression writers are struggling because they just reach back to that mythology. But
you know, that's 10 minutes of a 65-minute episode, so it really takes up. I mean, we think it's more because we're watching that bit really intently, but actually that's 10 minutes out of 65.
Absolutely. And I do love the imagery of the Cyber Lords. I don't know if it's terrible.
Oh, yes.
It's just brilliant.
Right, Simon, in 10th place on 20.7% is the one with the frog. It takes you away.
Yeah, you pointed to me because this was one of my favourites.
Uh-huh.
And I love the scene with the frog. I thought it was, and I maintain that scene with Jodie was peak Jodie, and it's what there should have been more of. There should have somehow they should have realised that the best stuff she does is the heartfelt stuff, and it's softer, and she exudes that enthusiasm that is kind of comes across as excitability all the time, is actually properly enthusiasm for life. And I think the show could have this era could have been far more meaningful than I think it is, if that makes sense. But I just think it was a really original episode. I love the setup. I love the fact that we're in a different country, a noticeably different country, and it just really worked for me. And yeah, it's a frog puppet, but it's just a puppet.
But Jodie sells it.
Yeah, exactly.
In 9th place on 27.6%, so the scores are actually moving up a bit here, The Witchfinders.
Just terrific episode. It's what you'd want of the series as one of the really kind of solid episodes. And Alan Cummings' turn, obviously, it's something there's not much of in that season, which is a big guest performance that just draws you in, and that really works. And Joey Wilkinson's script again, really solid, really well plotted. It's just a plain flat out good episode of Doctor Who.
The only problem with The Witchfinders is that it's the third of the 3 historicals in that first series, when it really needed to be the first, I think.
Yes.
Because it sets things up that pay off in the other 2, doesn't it? It sets up the idea of you mustn't interfere, which obviously, you know, going back, and we said this a lot at the time, is that this felt to me like this was Chris Chibnall trying to do the first William Hartnell season over for the 21st century, and so he was bringing in ideas and situations from that first William Hartnell series. And I think Witchfinders is, you know, the one that sort of parallels with the Aztecs clearly. And this sort of you mustn't interfere idea, I think, feels weird coming after Demons of the Punjab, where she's actually physically made them step back from interfering, and Rosa, where she's actually physically forced them into interfering. So the Witchfinders either needs to make it clear that they've already lived through those other 2 things, and so when she says don't interfere at the start, it needs to be, we know what happens when you interfere, let's just keep our hands off this time. That's what she needs to say, or else the other 2 need to come afterwards. And so the Witchfinders was a terrific episode and a lot of fun, but just felt like it was the wrong place in the series. And I do wonder if it moved, because I'm sure I heard that there was some shuffling around.
Yeah.
And in 8th place, speaking of those other 2 episodes, on 30% is Demons of the Punjab. And again, this was another one that you were very fond of, Simon.
Yeah. Do you know what? The funny thing is, though, I can't remember these all that well. There is something that's, maybe it's just my age, the fact I'm older watching this series, but they don't stick. And I couldn't give you details, but yeah, I do remember enjoying it quite a lot. And that's the thing. That's the complete paradox of this, is that I kind of couldn't. It wasn't that I couldn't wait for this era to end. I was just looking forward to one that I could connect with. So objectively, yeah, I think it was an awfully strong period of stories, but I don't think they necessarily connected.
Well, there's definitely a thing to be said that this is Doctor Who that's not, because Doctor Who for the 12 years before this had sort of primarily been aimed at sort of middle-aged white guys and other people as well. And I think the balance tips here, and I wonder if that's part of the reason too, because I think definitely this is not aimed primarily at sort of middle-aged white guys. Russell T Davies, for all that he put in all this teen stuff with the romance between David Tennant and Billie Piper, or even Christopher Eccleston and Billie Piper, he threw that in to appeal to the younger people, but there was a lot about what Russell T Davies was doing that was like, do you remember this from back in the 70s? Do you remember that from back in the 70s? And so on and so forth. I think there's been less of that in the last sort of 5 years. And, you know, we might think that's sort of a confection on top, and that's not the substance of what we're watching. But actually, when you remove that confection from the top, maybe the thing that we're watching just becomes that little bit less easy to digest.
Yeah, maybe.
Possibly. I mean, the other thing I think, which would again feed back to your point on the Hartley era, is that the two big historical stories early in this season are deliberately non-British history, and that's something the Hartley era specialise in, because I don't think the Hartley era goes into British history till Smugglers, maybe might be as late as that.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yet they're looking to add that kind of perspective, the wider perspective that the Hartley era had.
Yes, because of course that kind of disappeared pretty quickly when you got to sort of pseudo historicals, didn't? Because pseudo historicals were generally speaking mostly British and sometimes then by extension European history, but you very rarely got out of sort of easily recognizable things, because in the pseudo historicals the idea was that the backdrop was something that was a shortcut to the alien, right? You didn't need to know too much about the backdrop, you just needed to recognize it so you could see how different the alien looked once it arrived in medieval, you know,
or the
England,
monk,
or
where the anachronism is the deliberate point of it all.
Right, I'm going to skip 7th place and go to 6th place, as we're talking about it. In 6th place on 38.6% is Rosa, the other one of that trilogy of historicals from the first series. So this historicals from the first series have all landed up inside the top 10. That's pretty good going, really, isn't it? Considering that first series was the one that I think people struggled with a bit, sort of particularly fans, and, you know, almost by definition, the people voting in our poll are going to be people who are fans of Doctor Who and take more notice of it. To consider that of the stories that have ended up in the top 10, 4 of them are from that first year, and 3 of them are the 3 historicals from that first year, that kind of suggests that that first series went down rather better, I think, than people maybe think it did. Or maybe it's just that there were a few surprises there, and those episodes feel stronger because they were so surprising, because they were that little bit different.
Yeah, I'd agree, because I think there's a huge jump from that last Stephen Moffat season into the first Chris Chibnall season. I think it's probably the biggest jump between seasons there is in New Doctor Who. So that's why that season hasn't gone down well. And I think, as Simon has been saying, if you give it a bit of time, it's actually aged a lot better than you think it has, because you're not looking at that shock of the new again.
And speaking of the shock of the new, I guess now I'll go back down to 7th place, and on 36.6%, it's Spyfall.
I think Spyfall I always find kind of almost a game of two halves. I think the first half is a really nice setup, albeit really kind of loosely plotted, a lot of nice set pieces thrown together. But I know it's the issue I have. It's kind of, the second episode is really beautifully intentioned in introducing all these women from history, but I think with the Norrin yet Khan plot line, that kind of bumps into a place Doctor Who cannot go. You know, it's thank you for all your help. I can't save you from a concentration camp. Doctor Who cannot go to concentration camp. It can't go near them, because that immediately shows you the limitations of the character. The series can't deal with that real life horror.
But it doesn't address it.
It does it with that kind of the easy get out of the the fixed point in history stuff. And I get it, but you're still going, if someone's been so helpful to you, has been, you know, a good friend over so long, you would still try and do something, and it really, that one part of it really does bother me.
So it's a bit like Earthshock in that respect.
Yeah, I weep for Adric every day, I tell you.
I really enjoyed Spyfall, though. Even the second half, which is... So I think the first half is probably, as you say, is a lot stronger than the second half. But I think the second half...
The Kasavin are probably the best idea of the year. It's so strong visually with the, you know, the lights of it. It's unlike almost anything we've seen.
In fifth place, then, we're in top 5 territory now on 39.7%. So there were quite a bunch together there in 5th, 6th and 7th. It's War of the Sontarans. Simon, the Sontarans back to being an enemy again for the first time since Russell T Davies. Did that work?
Yes, I think it did. I think it was a successful reintroduction, I think.
What was nice about it was that he didn't ignore the comedy, but he managed to balance the comedy with horror and still stay true to the characters, right?
Yeah, this is it. The balance was played out perfectly, and Sontarans on horseback was not to love.
Oh, yeah, yes. that I wanted to ride a horse. It's worth it for that alone.
I've got to say, if you look over the Chris Chibnall era, and I don't think we give it credit for this, but some of the visuals properly startling in a way that some of the visuals from the 70s stick in our head. So yeah, Sontaran on a horseback. I mean, clearly that's, well, presumably that's an homage to stroke stolen from Planet of the Apes, where you see an ape on a horseback. But I think it works even better because in Planet of the Apes, the ape on a horseback is the first image, whereas we're so used to seeing the Sontarans in much more mundane settings that it's seeing the Sontaran on a horseback that's the surprise. And I think that's what works really well about it. In 4th place then, and just above that on 42.1%, The Haunting of Villa Diodati.
Yeah, okay, I saw this at the Gallifrey convention actually. So, and you know, I was there watching the audience reaction as much as the show itself, because I'd downloaded it early in the day because obviously I could do that via iPlayer, and it just went down with absolute gangbusters. It's perfect Doctor Who. You know, it's almost an archetypal Doctor Who ghost story, and it just absolutely. It's got some great guest casting on that. And yeah, and the visuals are good, the idea's good, it's genuinely spooky. It's just a really well-made episode of Doctor Who.
And yet for me, you see, The Haunting of the Villa Diodati is sort of intellectually the least satisfying probably of the whole era, because it's like, let's do this thing, let's do this other thing, let's do a third thing, let's justify that these things are all happening at the same time, and then let's just use them as a setup for something else anyway. And so, you know, it's like, is it a ghost story? Is it a monster story with the Cyberman? Is it a story about sort of the passions of the sort of romantic poets? And yeah, it's sort of all these things, but none of these things. And in any case, it's all really just heading towards the timeless children ultimately anyway. And just, it should be terrible. I think it does work. I agree with you. It wouldn't be one that I would think of as one of the best episodes of the era. I think it's a weird mess that just happens to work. Somehow just works. Right, the top 3 are head and shoulders above that on 60%. So now we go from 42% to, so everything below this point is on less than 50%, and we jump to 60%. In 3rd place, Fugitive of the Judoon.
The reveal. It's the reveal, isn't it?
Yeah,
but it's not just that it's the reveal, but it's because it does what oh god, what was the Master episode with the Master reveal in series 3 called? The one set in the far future. Utopia.
Oh, Utopia, yeah.
It does what Utopia did. It halfway through the episode, you suddenly become aware that something major is going to be revealed, and then you work out what it can only be, and then you're waiting to find out if you're right, and any variation of all those emotions for about 15 or 20 minutes. And like Utopia, I've only rewatched this once, but like Utopia, I think it does work even when you know what the revelation is, because of the tease and because of the character as well. Jo Martin's character from the start of the episode and her relationship with Neil Stuke. So I think some people have now written this off as a one idea episode, but I don't think it quite is. And I think the first half of it is better than the first half of Utopia. And while the second half of this might not quite be as good as the second half of Utopia, I think on balance, it kind of comes in at around about the same place, because the balance, I think, is better here than it was there.
I mean, it's essentially the Doctor walking in on human nature, isn't it?
Like, yes, it is.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yes.
And what's not to love? There's that phrase again.
So in second place, this was the story that was on everybody's list. So the story that came in first actually was, I think there was one person, possibly two, who didn't have the top story on their list. So everybody had this story on the list, but not everybody had it quite as high. So on 65.5%, Village of the Angels, which I think, like The Haunting of Villa Diodati, could have been a hell of a mess because of the amount of stuff it has to set up and resolve. Village of the Angels has to resolve some things and set other things up. And I think it does it really well.
It's a base under siege story, essentially.
Sort of. Village under siege, I guess.
Yes, village, but yeah, into the mini Doctor Who genres. But it's really well directed to maintain the tension of it. You know, the scenes in the corridors and and as alluded to earlier, the imagery, that flaming angel was beautiful. And the cliffhanger, obviously, which you go get out of that one.
Well, I love the way this fits in with the rest of Flux, and I think this is like underappreciated, because I think most people look at this and see the episode that might have stood apart. But I think this is so thoroughly integrated into Flux. I really don't see how this could have. I think any episode of this that wasn't part of Flux would have been vastly different from this, and I don't think would have been as good, because I think half of the stuff that really works really well in here is the stuff where it's taking things that have already been set up and the stuff where it's setting up things for later on. I mean, I don't think the idea of the Village of the Angels would have been that they were coming for the Doctor, and if they were coming for the Doctor, why would they have been? And any reason they could possibly have been coming for the Doctor would have been a disappointment next to it's because they're going off to see the Division. And I think, you know, I think this really, really works well within the context of Flux. Right, there's only one story left then, and this came massively ahead on 72.1%. I take it you've both noticed the one that we haven't talked about yet.
Oh, I think, was it one we talked about a few weeks ago, by any chance?
Yeah, so let's not bother talking about it now. I was JR. No, Power of the Doctor, obviously, in first place. Do you know what? There's this thing where, and there was, it must have been said, I can't remember quite whether it was, it must have been, and I think I do remember, that Peter Capaldi, because they did the extra episode and Stephen Moffat decided to tell a story where the 12th Doctor meets the first Doctor and they're both having an issue with regeneration. And I think, especially if it had been a classic Doctor actor, so it was David Bradley who was coming back, which I think mitigated against this slightly, but there was a sense in which it could have been imagined that Peter Capaldi's final story should have been about Peter Capaldi and was slightly undermined by the fact that there was another Doctor in it and that some of the attention was being taken away from him. But I don't think that's true. I think what Twice Upon a Time does really cleverly is it brings in the first Doctor in order to say something about the 12th Doctor, and thus makes it even more about the 12th Doctor, because the first Doctor is there subservient to him to be a part of his story. And I think the brilliant thing about the Power of the Doctor, because it's Jodie Whittaker's last story and it should be all about her, and it feels like all these other Doctors are a distraction, but I think the brilliant thing about this story is, again, all those other Doctors are there to be subservient to her character and to say something about her character, and they actually serve to make this story about the fact that she's going to regenerate even more potent And so the more I think about it, the more I think Chris Chibnall really did a bit of a genius job here. I think this is actually an amazing feat to have got away with doing something like The Power of the Doctor. And I know some people say, oh, I really enjoyed it, but it's a hot mess. I don't think it's a hot mess. I think it's a really coherent story with lots of really coherent themes threaded all throughout it, and lots of things that are being set up and paying off. It even pays off stuff that you didn't realize hadn't been paid off. So when the Master creates the Cyber Time Lords, what does he call them? Cyber Masters?
Cyber Lords or Cyber Masters?
Yeah, Cyber Masters. When he creates those, and they have the ability to regenerate, I think Chris Chibnall already is thinking ahead to how he's going to resolve this story. He might not have a very definite idea of what the story is, and so on and so forth, but it's clear that the Master and those Cybermen were always going to be in this story, even before he put the old Doctors and the other companions in. When it became the Centenary story, all those elements were added to it, clearly. I think it was always going to be about the Master and the Cybermen, and that's always going to be what the story of Jodie Whittaker's regeneration was. But the fact that it's about regenerating Time Lord Cybermen, and she's Jodie Whittaker, the one who's the Time Lord but not the Time Lord, who's about to regenerate, it's not a hot mess. It's a really integrated, coherent theme throughout her era that builds up to the end of her era. I think it's a really intelligent piece of writing, and I don't think we appreciate it enough. And it came first, and I still don't think we appreciated it enough because somebody left it off their list.
And it gives the impression of it almost being like a wish list for RTD to take off, because I imagine that he wants to take off with having Gallifrey missing again and gone. So
Just
therefore,
new,
it's
just the new, yeah.
It's a reset button for the Cybermen and for the Time Lords, that we're back to square one in some respects for the new era. So
yeah. And I'd also kind of go back to Joe's point on all the old Doctors. I'd say that's true of the companions as well. It's a lot of it, the Power of Doctor. It's about what the Doctor means. It's about what it is to be the Doctor. What does the Doctor? What effect does the Doctor have on everyone else? I rewatched it a couple of times since, and I really like it every time. I still tear up at William Russell coming back beyond words.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The stuff with the companions, the stuff about what it means to be the Doctor, is absolutely another theme of this, because when the Master takes the Doctor's body, that's where you turn that theme around to see what that theme is really all about. Because for those few minutes, it's about what it is to be the Doctor when you're not the Doctor, or what it is to not be the Doctor when you're the Doctor. Do you know what I mean? I think it's a really well put together story. And I think probably it's because everybody has this chip on their shoulder about Chris Chibnall that they don't give him the credit he deserves when he deserves it.
I'm fully prepared to give him a load of credit for this, because again, I thought he nailed the occasion. Because again, it's like, it's almost like Steve Moffat with the 60th. It's your big moment, and that you can nail that. Well done, absolutely well done. Round of applause, and it's nice to see the era go out on a high. It really is.
Right, I think that's a nice positive note to end on then. And at some point in the next couple of weeks, Matt will be back with the other team, and presumably that'll be a lot less positive. Until that happens, I was JR.
I was John.
And I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon. And if anybody's watching this on video, I think I'm going to leave the video running, because we're going to do a 20-minute review of Voyage of the Doctor now. Voyage of the Damned, I should say, sorry. As long as both of you are okay to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, just about.
Right, let's carry on into it. So I'll do the intro and we'll get straight into our review of Voyage of the Damned. You're listening to Who Review Extra. And for the next 15 or 20 minutes, we are going to be talking about Voyage of the Damned, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
I'm John.
And I'm Simon.
So the Christmas special that we landed upon this time around was the middle Russell T Davies Christmas special, David Tennant's second. No, David Tennant's third, actually, because all the Christmas specials are David Tennant, aren't they? Voyage of the Damned, the Kylie Minogue, the highest rating Doctor Who episode of the modern era, with 13.3 million, isn't it? It's
the second most watched episode of anything, of any TV show of that year.
Wow, and there you go. And that's the Kylie Minogue effect, right?
Yeah, and the only thing that beat it was the EastEnders episode immediately on after it. So Doctor Who got the, gave EastEnders the lead in on that.
Well, now. So, okay, I can remember I was out that Christmas day, and although I was recording it, this was at a time where you couldn't do live pause and rewind and stuff. So I got in just after it started, missed the first 2 minutes, and sort of had to sit through the rest of it and then go back and watch the first 2 minutes afterwards. And so my first impression of it, probably despite that, not because of that, but who knows, I didn't really like this at all on first viewing. But it's one that gets better and better every time I see it since then. So spoilers, this is actually a Doctor Who episode that I really do quite enjoy. But yeah, the first time I was actually kind of, oh my God, what on earth? It's just a Poseidon adventure. It seems to be a really badly done version of a Poseidon adventure, and I couldn't really see the point in it. And one thing I struggle with a lot with Russell T Davies stories is the length of the scenes, or maybe sequences rather than scenes. But he does seem to go to a place and then stay there for 5, 10, 15, even 20 minutes before he moves on. I made this point earlier in this recording session, but probably about a week or so ago, or at some point in the indeterminate future, according to if you're listening to this podcast. But this basically, it starts with a 15-minute sequence in the passenger lounge. Then it goes to a sort of 10-minute sequence as they make their way through some corridors. Then there's like a 20-minute bit as they're trying to cross a bridge. And then there's another 20-minute bit with, oh God, what's his name? The name of the baddie in this, Max Capricorn. Is that it? It is, isn't it? Yeah, then there's a 20-minute sequence with him at the end. And that's it. And then a 5-minute scene with, oh my God, and the 5-minute scene at the end goes on forever. Well, it's 5 scenes. This entire 70-minute episode is 5 scenes. 5 sequences, I should say, because it cuts back and forth between a few things. But it just takes forever to go anywhere or do anything. And yet I really enjoyed it. So Simon, what was your experience of Voyage of the Damned on broadcast, and what do you think of it now?
It's almost an inverse curve of what you're going through. I was a little bit dispassionate and kind of, yeah, right, can we have Donna, please? When I first watched it, I found it a little bit dull in a funny way. And every progressive viewing, and I watched it again this afternoon, and it gets less enjoyable every time I watch it. I think it's dating dreadfully. And I think there are great performances in there, and I think there are bad performances in there. And I think it's just dated, really. And a lot of things just look a little bit shonky. And my 14-year-old daughter sat down and watched a good chunk of it with me. And I, reading it into her reaction, she thought it was one of the worst ones she's watched.
How interesting. John?
I kind of agree on that kind of, you've seen it before with the Poseidon adventure, so you're almost just waiting for them to run through all the tropes on that. I remember thinking that back in, was it 2007 now?
On that point, it's not like Russell T Davies didn't do that. I think it's just that on this occasion, it was so obviously a very specific target that it was even more noticeable than usual, right?
Totally. And I mean, for me, what Russell T Davies does with those Christmas Day stories is he doesn't do an out-and-out Christmas story like Stephen Moffat does. He does, how should I put it, the blockbuster movie. It's like, that was the premiere at 3 o'clock. He fills that gap. So it's a thing you can sit around now that, the big premiere movie is no longer the thing. So it's from TV point of view, it's a really smart move. It's very much kind of, for me, a kind of also one of the definitive episodes of the Russell T Davies era. It's deliberately big and bold and telling a very simple story, and it's looking to entertain you. It's not particularly worried about rewatchability value, I don't think. It's just there to entertain the mass public on Christmas Day.
I would argue with that. I think it is about rewatchability. I think it's supposed to fill that Poseidon Adventure thing where it could be repeated every Christmas and people wouldn't get bored of it because they'd always be watching it through a slightly drunken haze and they wouldn't really care.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's not meant to stand up to sort of
it's not meant to stand up to
rewatching that Doctor Who fans do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point.
I kind of like it, but I don't love it like I do other episodes. You know, the better episodes of the era that I find.
See, I think one of the things about this is it's the first one that has the electric guitar in the opening theme.
Yes.
And I think that, for me, is just a kind of little signifier. Yeah, they're just kind of going for the obvious thing, but also an obvious thing with a little bit of a kick. And so for me, Voyage of the Damned is very obvious, but just has a little bit of a kick. I mean, we know he's going to kill people off, but the choices he makes about who he kills off, I think, are the right choices, and they're choices I can go with.
They're really interesting choices, though, because you have a look at them, and this is, I think, we might come back to it, because the Doctor, at the criticism of Town at this point, he's the hero. You know, he's the big hero. The people he promises to save, he doesn't save.
No, exactly.
Brilliant choice.
That whole speech he does, where he does that, I'm the Doctor, I'm 903 years old or whatever, and I'm going to save all of you and everybody else. And people mock that because they think it's too earnest. But the whole point of that is that it's deliberately too earnest so that the episode can turn it inside out.
Yep.
So it's Russell T Davies knows exactly how earnest that speech is, and it's a deliberate choice. Simon, I've got to come back to you. Let's talk about the actors a bit. You said some of the performances were good and some weren't so good. But I don't know, for me, all of the performances felt fine. So I don't know, what were the ones that you didn't think were so good?
Kylie's never great.
Do you not think so?
No, I don't.
Wow.
She's likable, but
it's
not necessarily a great performance. No, I kind of get what you're saying, that they're all of a start. Russell Tovey's great. Jeffrey Palmer. Jeffrey Palmer is brilliant and plays it straight and is really convincing. So yeah, I'm probably talking myself out of my own argument here, but you know, I don't know, maybe it's direction choices. I don't know. Sometimes it just doesn't seem to stack up, and it kind of feels a little bit full of its own importance. It's at a particular point in Doctor Who history where it was its kind of imperial phase, and therefore kind of just goes for it. And I suppose that's admirable in some respects, but it just doesn't really. I mean, I can't bear the host as a villain. It feels like we've seen it all before, and the whole, you know, I will kill you, or whatever it is they're saying over and over again. It's
like a new thing.
Yeah,
basically.
It just doesn't work.
See, the problems that you've got with it, I think, are problems that become even more apparent during series 4 that follows.
And
yet, obviously,
quite
for you,
possibly.
Yeah, but that works for you because it's Catherine Tate, right?
I didn't say any of that worked. I love watching Catherine Tate.
I mean, series 4 works for you in general because of Catherine Tate, right?
It's watchable because of Catherine Tate. That's not to say it's necessarily working any better. But for some reason, this particular story left me cold when I first watched it on a Christmas day when I was really looking forward to it, and it's continued to do so. And I can see the good in it. I really can. Visually, it's stunning if you freeze frame it. Sometimes some of the effects are a little bit, when the hosts are flying around and the discs are hovering around at 10 miles an hour and they're whacking them away with bars, and it's admirable.
Yeah.
It's, you know,
but then some of the other stuff in there's very good. And
Yes,
let's face it,
yes.
it just sets out to do a thing, and it does that thing.
Yeah. I agree totally. I just don't necessarily enjoy it.
I think people complained originally because it's doing Poseidon Adventure in half the time and on a TV budget. So really it is basically like 2 set pieces, both based around this big sort of open space, this sort of chasm. So really it's just essentially the one thing, whereas Poseidon Adventure had lots of set pieces, right? And this just patently can't afford to do the set pieces like that did. But I think despite that, the sort of ambition of this thing and how it achieves on the ambition it sets itself out to do, I think it does a good enough job. And I think mostly the rest of the cast, I think kind of is the cast that does make it, because they've all got Russell T Davies dialogue, and I tend to find Russell T Davies dialogue can be a bit sort of caricatured without being funny enough or insightful enough to justify the caricature sometimes. But I think this has got a decent enough cast that kind of papers over some of that. So, for example, the Van Hoffs, Debbie Chazen and Clive Rowe, I think really sell you on those 2 characters, despite the fact that Russell T Davies paints them in such broad strokes. And here's one that I want to ask you about.
It's a class thing, isn't it? It's for them. That's kind of really nicely realized. They are generally kind of vulgar, but not in an off-putting manner, I want to say.
But see, I think Russell T Davies overdoes that stuff.
Absolutely, I think he does here. To be honest, with the
material. Oh, absolutely,
the performers do sell it.
And the fact that he kills them off relatively early, and it's them he chooses to kill off the earliest, basically, I think sort of solves that problem and also mitigates against it, because I think he has painted them in such broad strokes and he's made them so vulgar, or he's comically vulgar, that I think by killing them off first, he gives them a bit more integrity than really he gave them as characters. And go on, Simon, sorry.
I was going to say that repeated shot of them, every person who falls to their death does it in slow motion, waving to the camera.
Yeah.
And that becomes annoying by the time it happens to Kylie. So anyway, it's one of those.
And she falls out of the cab of the truck, which is like, what?
Yeah.
And it falls at a different pace she does, and so on and so forth. It's television, guys. I think she gives a lovely natural performance, actually. I really liked her performance. I thought maybe she should have gone broader, but I don't think she does go broad. And I think maybe because she doesn't go broad, she feels like she's in a different production to some of the other actors. But then I think also Clive Swift, and I know Doctor Who fans, we're not supposed to like Clive Swift, but I think he gives a lovely performance too. So I think
you'd never know that if he had any misgivings that he had any. I think he's pretty solid in it.
No, he sells that comedy nicely, or but it's not that easy comedy to sell, that kind of false thing, and he has to know it's not true.
Yeah.
But he has to put the front set, and he plays that so beautifully.
And between them, he and Kylie have a sort of nice, easygoing charm that plays against the broadness of everybody else, that I think gives this episode a bit, because see, people always talk about how much heart Russell T Davies' stories have, and I'm not sure that's entirely true all the time.
I think they're brutal. Russell T Davies stories are absolutely brutal.
I don't mean necessarily in that respect.
In a way as well at times. Yeah.
But I think Simon's got it. I think it's the grotesquerie and the broadness. And I think some people buy into the sort of organics of that, I guess. But for me, I find a lot of Russell T Davies' stuff really contrived. And I find this contrived too. But I find Clive Swift and Kylie Minogue play against the contrivances and actually manage to get something real out of it. I don't think is really there in Russell T Davies' scripts. Jackie, everybody goes on about what a realistic character Jackie is, and to me she seems like the biggest caricature and one of the least real people in all of his Doctor Who. But I think Kylie and Clive Swift play a reality and bring something out, and actually Bernard Cribbins does too in his short time on screen. And so there's this nice little area of the story that is the bit that keeps drawing me through it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the point of the exercise we're doing. You've got all the British character actors playing kind of relatively minor roles here,
Yeah.
and that's
Well,
part of the charm of it.
well, and Geoffrey Palmer as well, of course. And Russell Tovey gets to play a nice part. I don't think Russell Tovey's brilliant in Being Human, actually. I don't think he's quite as brilliant here, but he's decent enough.
He doesn't have much material, to be fair. I don't think he's just got to stand there and look panicked for the most
basically. Simon, is there anything of this that you do like, that you would like to celebrate?
As I say, it looks great. If you freeze frame a lot of these scenes, then it's great. But I don't
think
know.
some of
The
production design. There are things like having the portholes instead of windows. And that's sort of not necessary, but the way it's done is quite nice and feels distinct. And the production design throughout, I think, is kind of solid. It's not spectacular that makes you go, oh wow, that's amazing, but it's solid enough.
I think it has scale. Yeah, I think it could have fallen down in that respect. It could have looked like a real home DIY production, but it doesn't. It doesn't look like that. I think there are certain shots where the decisions aren't necessarily the best ones for the scale, but yeah, certainly the sets and what have you.
And one thing I really like about it is the fact that the villain is just a capitalist. And they've made him especially grotesque. But the way he's played by, is it George Costigan? Yeah, George Costigan. Yeah. The way he plays it. And he plays, so when the Doctor turns up, he plays it as if, well, who's this idiot? And he never stops playing it as if he's thinking, who's this idiot? And whenever the Doctor says something really sort of intelligent or whatever, or sort of sticks it up him, he just kind of looks at him as if to say, just get out of my sight. What are you doing here? I love that performance. It's funny and it's not real. And, you know, he's wearing all this weird stuff because they've put him in this box, a little bit like Arcturus out of the Curse of Peladon or something. I don't know quite what was going on there. And it makes for a really bizarre ending. The ending where Kylie Minogue sends him off the edge of the thing in her forklift truck. Yeah. It's the direction, but that just doesn't work at all. But who cares? I forgive it that. But him, I think he's brilliant.
I think I love that moment where he comes out in reality and he does the smile and you get the glint. Didn't really do that. Beautiful.
Yeah. And it's nice that the villain is a capitalist rather than an alien monster of some kind.
Yeah, just a venal motivation. And it's just a bit of revenge. It's petty, and it's kind of amid all that kind of grandiose splendor of what you're supposed to be in. It's just that little rotten humanity at the heart of it, which is such a nice idea.
Is there anything else that either of you wants to say about this, or should we give it a score?
Yeah, I think Simon mentioned the Imperial phase. I think this is kind of the start of the Imperial phase. This is where Doctor Who becomes huge. It becomes inescapable, and where you get that build up season 4, and towards the end of season 4, every one of I think last 4 or 5 episodes are in the week's top 10. So this is kind of where they've got the confidence and where they know they can go almost anywhere.
Yeah, for sure. Right, John, I'm going to ask you for a score first so that you can load up the randomizer so that you can choose the story for next
time. I would say probably it's a 7 for me. It's not one I'd necessarily choose to go back to. It's not my favourite Christmas story, but I think it aims for a pastiche and it works really nicely on that score. They get away with what they're doing. There's some nice direction. The character performances are really nice, really sort of fit the piece. So Yeah, I'll go with a 7.
For sure. Right, and while I load up my spreadsheet so that I can remember the stories that we've already done, so in case you accidentally choose something we've already done, I can say, no, choose again, because we should have organised this before and we didn't. I'm going to ask Simon then to give it a score.
I think it's going to have to be a 6. Because it's not bad, but there's something about it. It just leaves me a little bit cold. I think the resolution at the end, the Mr. Copper ending is great, really great.
Although
But at
it
the end of the
goes
day,
on for
pretty much
so long.
I know pretty much everyone's died, and there's a and the only person the Doctor's grieving really is Astrid. Regardless of all those people who got wiped out by the host, it just doesn't sit right with me. So therefore, it's a 6.
Yeah, that's fair enough. On the other hand, I'm going to give it an 8 because I just, despite all its faults, I just really enjoy this one. And I think weirdly that's true of a lot of Russell T Davies episodes, despite all the problems I have with a lot of the stuff he does. And I'm just hoping that carries on into the new era. Right, John, I want you to limit yourself to classic series since we're doing a new series story now. And just give me a random title from the classic series.
Off. Okay. Here we go. Choose a story. Anyone fancy going to Peladon?
Oh yes,
Curse
which
of Peladon?
one? Curse of Peladon it is then. That'll be our next review. Curse of Peladon. Wow. Well, that's very different from this, maybe. But it's weirdly enough an episode that I referenced about 6 minutes ago. Right, until we do that, I was JR.
I was John.
And I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon. Right, now I have to turn off the video.